Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Russia has weathered crippling Western sanctions. The US says that there are extraordinary economic opportunities in the nation. But are there, and will American companies get back into business in Russia? The EU and India want to boost economic ties. They aim to finalise a free trade deal by the end of this year. So are the two sides growing closer, and will they be able to reach an agreement? It's seen as an historic shift in Germany's stance on borrowing limits. The nation's likely new government has agreed to relax debt rules to boost defence spending. So what's behind the plan, and will it be approved? And with a lack of jobs in Senegal, thousands of people are competing for a limited number of work visas in Spain. Why are so many Senegalese people unemployed? And can the country's president fix the problem? After 3 years of Western sanctions, Russia could once again be open for American businesses, but that's only if a deal can be done to end the war in Ukraine. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that the two nations could then pursue potentially historic economic partnerships and incredible opportunities. Rubio's comment came after watershed talks with Russian officials in Riyadh last month. And last week, President Donald Trump said that he wants to see major economic deals with Moscow and is in advanced talks to cobble some together. Russia says that it's open for economic cooperation with the US, including on energy and the mining of rare earth minerals. But its war-driven economy is overheated, interest rates are high, and the business environment is unpredictable. Dmitry Medvedenko reports.
The war in Ukraine has been costly for Russia. The economy has been battered by sanctions, a globally isolated banking sector, a weakened ruble, and the withdrawal of Western companies. But all of this may change now that
in Washington, there is a new sheriff in town.
Donald Trump began a rapid rapprochement with Moscow soon after taking office. With the push to end the war in Ukraine and a failed minerals deal with Kiev,
it's going to be a very hard thing to do business like this.
Trump is now increasingly sending positive signals to Moscow.
I'd like to buy minerals on Russian land too, if we can. The rare earth. They have very good rare earth also. They both do, I would say that, and oil and gas. Look, it's a great thing. If we sell this, it's great for Russia too.
The Kremlin has said that any normalization of relations with the West will require the lifting of sanctions, and Washington says this means Europe as well.
In order to bring an end to any conflict, there has to be concessions made by all sides. The European Union is going to have to be at the table at some point because they have sanctions as well that have been imposed.
Thousands of Western companies pulled out of Russia when it invaded Ukraine in 2022. Their businesses were, in many cases, acquired by local players. McDonald's, for example, replaced by Vkusno i Tochka, which was mostly just a marketing makeover. If Western businesses choose to come back, they will be competing with these analogues. They will also find the economy in an unstable state. The country's GDP grew 4% last year. This was driven mainly by the military-industrial complex, with a third of the federal budget spent on national security. Ending the war could impact the economy negatively if these expenses are cut. Inflation is running officially at 9%, but some goods have more than doubled in price over the last 3 years. The central bank's key rate of 21% is making it very expensive to borrow and, for example, launch a new business. The Kremlin says the prospect of lifting sanctions and seeing Western businesses coming back is distant.
There is a long way to go, because the entire set of bilateral relations has been greatly damaged. But if the political will of the two leaders, President Putin and President Trump, is kept, then we'll clear this distance quickly enough.
For any of this to happen, the first step would be putting an end to the war in Ukraine. And Washington has threatened Moscow with more sanctions if a deal is not reached. Dmitry Medvedenko, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Richard Connolly is a senior analyst for Russia and the CIS at Oxford Analytica. He's an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, and he joins us now from Geneva. Richard, good to have you with us on Counting the Cost. In what sort of state is Russia's economy right now?
It's not in a bad state. Good morning, Adrian. It's certainly done better over the last 3 years than many people thought that it would when Western sanctions were imposed following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It grew by 4.1% last year and the year before it. It's currently slowing down because it's very difficult to maintain that brisk rate of growth. It faces a few problems in the form of rising inflation and a tight labor market. But generally speaking, it's in pretty good shape.
So here's the big question. Do you see American businesses returning to Russia anytime soon? What would it take for that to happen? Would they want to return?
And that's a very that's why I think the most important point. I think what it would take first would, of course, be some form of political agreement, accord between the United States and Russia. That would be a necessary condition for things to move forward. It would also require some form of significant sanctions relief. They'd need to change and remove a lot of the barriers that currently exist for US firms doing business in Russia. But then even if those two conditions are in place, it would then require, as you suggest in your question, that US firms see the commercial opportunity in entering Russia. Now, there's a lot of ways in which they could make money, but a lot of foreign firms have been burnt in Russia in the past, both as a result of the war, but also before. So it's not immediately obvious that there'll be a rush of US investors entering Russia, even if sanctions are lifted.
So what do you suspect are Donald Trump's motivations for wanting to get economic relations, at least, onto a more normal footing with Russia? Is it just about rare earth minerals?
I don't think so. For me, I suspect that this is the economics feeds into the broader political picture. I think there's a desire to have a working relationship with Russia, and that Trump, being a former businessman, sees the commercial side as being an important part of that. I suspect, though, that there aren't too many people within either the administration or the US business community who will have really seen this as an important part of any future relationship. US investment in Russia was much smaller before the war than, let's say, European investment in Russia. So I think that this would be an important, but by no means the most significant part of any future thaw in US-Russian relations.
To what extent does Russian oil and gas play into all of that? Is the US interested in tapping into that energy? I mean, it's got its own supplies. And if it did, would Europe follow suit? I mean, Europe has been particularly badly hurt by the lack of access to cheaper Russian energy.
Correct. I think if we're thinking about the US and Russia and US potential for investing in oil and gas, it's important to note that in gas, especially in liquefied natural gas, so LNG, Russia and America are rivals. So it's highly unlikely that US firms are going to invest in Russia when they are currently trying to take Russian market share in global LNG markets. The same, I think, is true of oil. Of course, there'll be some potential for US firms to invest in some Russian oil fields, but again, that has proven to be an often costly and often problematic experience for American firms in the past. So I think there'll be some reluctance to dive straight in. For the Europeans, as you suggest, if they were to start buying Russian gas again, that could help European industry tremendously, because cheap Russian gas, and Russian gas is the cheapest type of gas, if we're just looking at the price available to European consumers, that would be a real boon for European industry. But we're a long way from that.
I was going to ask you, actually, you suspect that this is all going to be quite a long way in the future?
Absolutely. I think even if we look at the US, even if Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin meet personally and come to some form of agreement, the lifting of a lot of the sanctions that the United States currently has in place will require congressional approval. And that makes it very difficult to lift sanctions. The United States has imposed sanctions on lots of countries in recent decades, and it has a very poor track record in lifting them. And that's because it often requires congressional approval as well as a presidential decision. So I do think that despite some of the headlines, the chances of sanctions relief taking place on any meaningful scale are still pretty low. And that's just the United States. I think the Europeans are further behind the US when it comes to the politics of reaching out to Russia. And so even for Europe, I think we're looking at an even longer period before any type of sanctions relief are offered by them as well.
Richard, it's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
Ukraine says that it will try to ramp up domestic weapons production after Donald Trump suspended all US military aid to the nation. A US official says that Washington is reviewing whether billions of dollars given to Kyiv is contributing to a solution to end the war with Russia. The move comes after that contentious meeting between Trump and President Volodymyr Zelensky last week. It's being seen as an attempt to increase pressure on Zelensky to make concessions to end the conflict. President Trump has made it clear that he wants to lower borrowing costs for Americans, but instead of putting pressure on the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates, Trump and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent have turned their attention to lowering the yield on 10-year US government bonds. Now, the 10-year T-bill yield is a lending benchmark that influences borrowing costs on everything from mortgages to corporate bonds. Lower yields allow rates across the economy to fall and could help bring down borrowing costs for consumers. Yields, or annual returns, fall when bond prices rise, meaning the Trump administration will need to reduce government borrowing, which will eventually decrease the supply of bonds or make US debt more appealing to investors. Bessent said that the 10-year yield could naturally fall by increasing the supply of oil and gas and bringing down energy prices. The yield on the 10-year T-bill did decline in February, but perhaps not for the reasons the president wants. Investors are concerned that Trump's tariff threats and layoffs of government workers could slow America's growth. They're piling into bonds as a safe haven alternative to volatile stock markets. A fiscal sea change designed to restore and rearm Europe's largest economy, economists say. Germany's likely incoming government has announced plans to boost defence spending by relaxing the country's strict borrowing rules. They've also said that they'll seek to set up a $533 billion fund to finance spending on infrastructure over the next 10 years. Now, provision would exempt defence spending above 1% of GDP from the debt brake that caps government borrowing. That marks a historic shift in the country's conservative approach to borrowing. The debt brake is enshrined in the Constitution, and the two bills, which need a two-thirds majority to pass, will be presented in Parliament next week. Joining us now from Berlin is Al Jazeera's Dominic Kane. Don, why is this happening now? What does it mean?
It's happening now because the man who is very likely to be the next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, the man whose party came first in the recent general election, says that Germany now needs to be a grown-up. Germany now needs to assert its role in Europe. He's looked at what the Trump administration has been doing vis-à-vis Ukraine, Europe, NATO, and says that now is the time for Germany to rearm and to take its role. But what does that actually mean? This reform of the debt brake, what he's effectively talking about there is anything over 1% of GDP. Well, factually, that would be anything over 44 billion euros, or in dollar terms, $47.5 billion. Any spending above that limit would not be constrained by the debt brake. So in other words, if he wants to put a lot of money, a lot of finance into defence, that would be the way to do it. The other reason it's happening now, well, that's much more political, because the Parliament that was elected on the 23rd of February needs to start sitting by the 25th of March. When it does, there will not be the two-thirds majority for Mr. Merz and his partners to get this through. It's got to get a two-thirds majority. That's why the vote is taking place next week. But it's also going to have to get a two-thirds majority in the other House of Parliament. And the numbers there are very tight indeed. In the end, Mr. Merz needs his political opponents in the Green Party to vote for this. If it happens, then he will get what he wants, and he will be able to spend that money on defence. But there's so much that currently is still to be decided.
Al Jazeera's Dominic Kane reporting from Berlin. Dom, many thanks indeed. There are more than 6,000 European companies doing business in India. The EU is now the nation's largest trading partner, ahead of the US and China. The bloc aims to boost economic ties with the Asian nation even further. In a recent visit by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to New Delhi, the two sides agreed to finalise a free trade deal, which has stalled for years, by the end of 2025. But will the EU and India be able to overcome their differences and reach an agreement? To discuss that, we're joined now from Bethesda, Maryland, by Ajay Chibba, who's a distinguished visiting scholar of the Institute for International Economic Policy at George Washington University. Good to have you with us, sir. So what are the chances of the EU and India being able to finalise this deal by the end of the year?
Well, it's very possible. As you said, there's a very strong push on both sides. Especially since both are being threatened by very high tariffs from the United States. The precursor to this is a very good EFTA trade deal. That's with the four countries, Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, which was signed last year and which promises to increase bilateral investment by over $100 billion. Between those EFTA countries and India. So if that starts to work, that will have a positive effect on the broader EU-India trade deal. Of course, the EU-India has a Trade and Technology Council that has been working on this for some time, and that they will really have their work cut out to make this happen by the end of the year.
Why, sir, has this deal taken so long? As we said, it had been stalled for years.
Yeah, so there's a lot of factors. The devil is always in the detail. And as you said, of course, trade has picked up. But despite that, India has very high tariffs on cars, on wine, and on bulk agriculture products. It doesn't have, in the minds of the EU investors, insufficient investment protection agreements. And then its public procurement contracts are not that open. So that's the complaint on the EU side. But on the Indian side also, the EU has banned the sale of 700 pharma products, which are tested in India. Now, these are sold as generics even in the United States, but the EU doesn't find that to be sufficient. India is a major exporter of pharmaceuticals, especially generics. Then there are data safety issues. The EU, doesn't consider India to be as data safe as they would like it to be. So, which means that a lot of back office work that is done in India by many companies around the world, gets hampered.
Can I ask you, sir,
Yeah.
who needs more who right now, the EU or India?
Well, India certainly needs the EU because India's sales to the EU are about, if you add up goods and services, are about $100 billion. But EU imports, I'm not counting intra-EU trade, I'm counting extra-EU trade. EU imports 2.8 trillion worth of goods and services. So India certainly could expand its exports hugely into the EU market. On the EU side, of course, the fact that now they are getting restricted in the United States, they are looking for opportunities. And the fact is that India will soon be the third largest economy in the world and growing at a very rapid rate. So there's huge upside potential, both for India, I would say, and for the EU.
I wanted to ask you, sir, what has changed mood music-wise to bring these two sides together? Is it the fact that Donald Trump is in the White House and is upending the world economic order and introducing tariffs? Is that what's forcing India and the EU to finally get this deal over the line?
Yeah, I think India has always been very keen on this deal because, for India, it's a huge market that we haven't been able to penetrate. We have penetrated to some extent now, and it's growing, but not as much as India would like to. But certainly for the EU, it's looking for friends now that it's become quite clear that the US is quite hostile to the EU itself. So I think that's the impetus. There was a very large delegation, as you said, led by Ursula von der Leyen to India recently, and clearly the optics of that were very positive. But, it's not going to be an easy agreement to make. So, there'll be a lot of discussion that will have to take place. But, once the political leadership on both sides makes a push, I think it's possible, but it's not going to be an easy one.
It's really good to talk to you, sir, on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
After his election victory last year, President Bassirou Diomaye Faye promised sweeping reforms to help improve living conditions in Senegal. But today, many Senegalese young people still struggle to find work. They're leaving the country in droves, looking for opportunities elsewhere. More than 300,000 unemployed people have applied for seasonal visas to work on Spanish farms ahead of the harvest. But with only 350 spots available, competition is fierce. Al Jazeera's Nicholas Hack reports now from the village of Tataguine in Senegal.
If only there was a well in the village of Tataguine, then Abdulaziz Ndiaye would not be trying to go to Spain. He sees in his fields untapped possibilities. Water, he says, is like magic, turning sand into crops.
I can grow salads, carrots, beans and onions. I could earn enough to feed my family and not have to go to Europe.
Hoping to fund a well, Ndiaye applied for the seasonal visa scheme to work on farms in Spain. The leaders of the two countries revived a 2-decade-long seasonal work visa scheme in 2024 to curb illegal migration and to help Spain deal with its manpower shortage. At a gathering in Portugal last October, Spain's Prime Minister warned that Europe faces a looming labor crisis and is set to lose 30 million working-age people over the next 20 years.
Europe is suffering from a demographic winter. It can tackle it in different ways. One, with technology, increasing productivity, and two, with birth rate policies. But let's face it, we are not going to have the birth rate that Spain had, for example, in the 1980s. And three, migration. Almost 50% of economic growth in Spain over the last 20 years has come from the contribution of immigration to economic growth.
A record 47,000, mostly Africans, arrived illegally in Spain last year. Many end up working in the fields. Cheap, illegal laborers paid a fraction of the wages given to locals.
Just one short season working the farms in Spain would bring enough funds to turn this barren land into life, bring water here, grow crops, and stop the flow of migration so that people can have opportunities right here on their land.
Sharif Faye took part in the scheme. Unlike many, he returned home. With the savings, he bought enough livestock to secure a modest living. But he carries with him the painful memories of back-breaking work picking pears and apricots, fruits he can't afford to buy or grow.
It's hard work. You sleep little, you work a lot. Waking up at 4 a.m, walking 50 kilometers in a day for a small meal and the manager shouting at you. It doesn't feel right.
Ndiaye is competing with young, skilled, unemployed graduates, clutching their diplomas, hoping to find work they cannot find at home. 300,000 applicants, vying for just 350 spots. Ndiaye calls a friend who, like him, applied for the scheme. Weeks have passed with no news. The silence feels familiar. He fears he has been duped and that his application has not been processed. With it comes the realization of having lost the family savings and the possibilities of a new life. Nicholas Hawk, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost, Tataguine, Senegal.
Susanna Osebi is a tactical intelligence analyst at Control Risks, a global risk consultancy firm, and she joins us now from Dakar in Senegal. Good to have you with us, Susanna. Why is Senegal's unemployment rate running so high?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. So Senegal's employment rate is pretty high right now because the economic and fiscal situation is pretty stressed at the moment, and it's likely to remain that way for the next few years. For example, the Court of Auditors in late February published a report stating that the general debt of the government, it's actually hit almost 100% of the GDP, meaning that Senegal for the next few years is going to have less room for debt and higher debt costs. So this actually impacts the job market and actually mostly impacts women, the youth, and workers in rural areas.
And for those of us who aren't so familiar with Senegal and its economy, what are the main drivers of economic activity in Senegal?
So the economic activity is mainly driven by the primary and secondary sector. So agriculture, livestock, the fishery sector as well is really prominent in Senegal. So actually, for example, in 2023, the economy reached a growth of 4.3%, and this actually was led by the primary and the secondary sectors mainly.
So does the president have a viable plan for fixing the economy, this debt problem that you talked about, and increasing employment?
Yeah, so actually the government has a plan, economic plan, that includes tackling unemployment and irregular migration. So, for example, the Ministry of Labor in February declared that the government launched a grand coalition for employment that will tackle unemployment rates and will actually boost the private sector. At the same time, the Ministry of Youth declared in November last year that the government is currently developing a plan of a national youth plan to tackle unemployment, specifically regarding youth in Senegal. However, the government was able to secure a parliamentary majority only in November 2024, meaning that these programs are still not in place. So it will take time for them to implement them and to actually see if they are working on the employment rate in Senegal.
Susanna, it's been great talking to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Have a great day.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, I'm at @Finnegan on X. Try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC, or you can drop us a line. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, and entire editions for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.